The Trudeau Liberals wrecked Canada, and now they want to keep it. When the Trudeau Liberals say we're all in this together, they mean themselves, the Laurentian elites. And this was on full display during the two Liberal leadership debates this week, one in French and one in English. Now, these debates were in some ways excruciatingly boring, but also very revealing. And the reason it's important that we cover these is because one of these people who are on stage, one of the four people, is going to be Canada's next prime minister. We don't know for how long, but one of these people will in fact be Trudeau's successor at 24 Sussex. So for those of you who don't know and have gratefully avoided this spectacle, the Liberal leadership race includes Trudeau's former deputy prime minister and erstwhile finance minister female clone Chrystia Freeland, his longtime backer and close advisor Mark Carney, and then two no-names, Carney Gould and businessman Frank Baylis. Now, the frontrunners, which are Chrystia Freeland and Mark Carney, are as close to Trudeau as it is possible to be, and of course with each other as well. In fact, Mark Carney is actually the godfather of Chrystia Freeland's son, which is why they affectionately clutched each other at one of the debates. Mark Carney obviously trying the Trudeau hug, although the Trudeau hug turned out to be kind of the kiss of death for most of his other female employees in cabinet. Now, all four during this debate, during the English debate in particular, I couldn't watch the French one, tried to run against Donald Trump. But what was really remarkable about this lackluster debate is that although they all claimed that Trump was ready to annex Canada, they did so without any kind of passion, without even any kind of anger. And you'd think that if Canada was on the verge of being invaded by the neighbors to the south, they'd be a little bit more upset about it. But the lines felt very tired, very practiced. In fact, Chrystia Freeland consistently had to look down at her notes to deliver the most basic lines, which shed some insight into why our budgets have been so bad. And the same thing is true for Mark Carney. It's really not hard to really muster up some anger about somebody trying to invade this country, but halfway through a line that was clearly written by speechwriters to be impressive and forceful and statesmanlike, they would have to glance back down at their notes to kind of check to see what they were going to say. And that's because these people really, really are insincere. They've wrecked the country over the past 10 years. And yes, that very much includes Chrystia Freeland, who was Trudeau's closest ally from the very beginning, and Mark Carney, who was Trudeau's preferred advisor. Most of the lines that they used about Donald Trump came off more or less like they were at some mandatory and boring business meeting. And you kind of get the sense that Freeland and Carney feel that way. They feel entitled to run the country. They feel like they own Canada, and they're just going through the motions, presenting their resumes at this debate so they can get on with the business of running Canada like they feel they have a God-given right to do. And so I'm not going to talk about Frank Baylis or Karen Gould. They were willing to say sometimes more interesting things, but the only reason they did so is because neither of them has a chance of being prime minister, and therefore they have the privilege of promising all kinds of stuff they're never going to have the chance to implement. But to make sure that this review is actually useful to the viewers, we're going to stick to the two primary frontrunners, Chrystia Freeland, Trudeau in address, and Mark Carney, his close advisor and the godfather of Chrystia Freeland's son. So let's start with Freeland here. She spent most of the debate, and it would have been genuinely amusing if it wasn't so irritating and if Canada wasn't in such a shambolic state after 10 years of her mismanagement. She spent this whole time trying to kind of dress up the Trudeau legacy by bragging about the abysmal economy, but the way she bragged about the abysmal economy is by pulling the Liberal trick, and she's been using this trick for years. She kind of produced numbers that sounded really impressive, like Canada has a AAA rating, but numbers that mean really nothing for Canadians who are struggling under a massive tax burden, and Canadians who, quite frankly, are still struggling to make ends meet due to skyrocketing inflation. I live in Canada. I pay bills here. I buy groceries here. And so it's borderline offensive to hear the person who helped run this economy into the ground taking numbers that mean nothing to the average Canadian and pretending, well, we should all be really, really happy then. And it crossed my mind watching her performance that she's kind of making the same mistake that Kamala Harris did by essentially claiming everything's great. If Americans would just read the right newspapers, if Americans would watch the right TV shows, they'd realize that things were just fine. Now, how well did that work out for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris? Not very well. And in fact, now you've got American newspapers who plugged for the Democrats saying, as it turns out, the American voters were right on the economy and the Democratic politicians were wrong. And I sincerely hope the Liberals find this out the hard way as well. Now, even though Chrystia Freeland went to great lengths to defend the Trudeau legacy, she never did so by name. And Trudeau was kind of like the ghost in the background of this entire thing. I watched well over an hour and a half of the 2-hour debate. I skipped some boring sections, and I didn't hear Trudeau's name come out once because he's kind of like the turd in the punch bowl at this Liberal debate. Nobody wants to use his name because they all recognize that at the end of the day, his brand is now incredibly toxic. The brand that rescued the Liberal Party from ignominy in 2015 is now so toxic that even somebody who's been photographed hugging him more times than I can count doesn't want to use his name. And so while she was talking about the great Liberal legacy, she actually went back to Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin, said we really need to return to those days. And so she defended the Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin legacy instead of defending, her own legacy. And if these ideas were so great, she's had 10 years to do this stuff. And again, she had the most important portfolios. She was in finance. She was deputy prime minister. And so if these were such great ideas, it's kind of embarrassing that she never considered doing so to begin with. I'm going to show you a couple of clips of Freeland just to give you a taste of them. I apologize in advance. There are some speakers who are just very difficult to listen to because they do not have good oratorical skills. They do not have good skills of rhetoric. And I just find her voice incredibly irritating. If you compare her speeches to, say, somebody like Margaret Thatcher, it's just night and day difference. She just has this affect that makes her very grating to listen to because she kind of sounds like she's preaching to you, but simultaneously trying not to preach to you, and the effect doesn't come off. It just, again, comes off as kind of grating. And even worse, this kind of just gives you an idea of how tone deaf Chrystia Freeland is. She started off her speech at both of the debates, the French debate and the English language debate, telling this story that zero people believe. But when a politician puts together their talking points in their speeches, they get a writing team together, they bat things back and forth, they test out different lines, and then they produce something that they agree on. I've talked to a lot of speechwriters before. I write for a couple of former speechwriters. My editor actually at the Western Standard is Nigel Hannaford, who is a former Stephen Harper speechwriter. And so this story in that context shows how out of touch Chrystia Freeland's team might be. So let me show you this clip and then I'll tell you what I think of it.
A few weeks ago in Saskatoon, I met a 4-year-old girl named Ari. She asked me, "Can you stop Trump from invading Canada?" Ari is a smart girl, and she's asking the right question. I'm running to be leader of the Liberal Party and the next Prime Minister of Canada because Trump is posing the gravest challenge our country has faced since the Second World War.
So that is a terrible story, terribly told. Notice when she had to look down at her notes there. It's like, I'm running for Prime Minister of Canada. Why am I running for Prime Minister of Canada again? And then she looks back up at the camera. That's the part where she needs to check her notes, why she's running for Prime Minister of Canada. The other problem with the story is it's obviously not true. There's no way some 4-year-old girl from Saskatchewan skipped up to Chrystia Freeland to say, is Trump going to invade Canada? Unless she was specifically coached to do so, which I also kind of doubt. And the fact that Chrystia Freeland, who of course has been in the Liberal Trudeau bubble now for about a decade, thought that story was relatable or believable gives you an idea of how catastrophic her instincts are and how awful the instincts of her team must be. Because I just don't believe it. And nobody believes that stuff. Canadians watching this aren't thinking, a 4-year-old girl from Saskatoon thinks Donald Trump is going to invade Canada, and Chrystia Freeland, this person, she is going to stop that from happening, and that's why she is, checks notes, running for Prime Minister. That's nonsense, and everybody watching it knows that it's nonsense. It's basically an insult to our intelligence, although perhaps not to hers. Nobody on the stage believed the story either, but they all kind of smile and nod along. And I do find this stuff genuinely frustrating because they're treating the voters like everybody's an idiot, and that this is a story they're totally going to believe, that we're going to be swept up in the fervor of Chrystia Freeland's touching story about the little girl who didn't want to get invaded by Trump, and now we're all going to forget the last 10 years and we're going to vote for her. But there's one other clip that I think is important to watch, because the Liberals are really hoping right now that the threatened Trump tariffs, which may in fact be implemented at the beginning of March, are going to sweep them back into power, that they're going to be able to hang on to power after their approval rating dropped to 16% prior to the tariff threats. I think the side effect of the Trump tariffs could be the Liberals getting an extra lease on power with a minority government, if they call a snap election, right after they fill the prime ministerial spot with one of these guys. And they're really hoping that this patriotism, which they've done their best to suppress now for 10 years. Keep in mind that Justin Trudeau kept the Canadian government flags flying at half-mast for months after the news broke that there were bodies buried near a Kamloops residential school. And of course, an in-depth investigation found no bodies, but he actively admitted to be running a genocidal state. Not that Canada was even guilty of a genocide in the past, but was currently a genocidal state, ignoring the fact that Indigenous people from the United States fled across the border to Canada where it was safe, including famous figures like Sitting Bull, in the knowledge that the much maligned first Prime Minister Sir John A. Macdonald would use government money to send them food all the way to the prairies before the CPR existed, when it was still very difficult. So we've lived through 10 years of watching Canada's heritage get smeared. And now we got to listen to Chrystia Freeland talk about this wave of patriotism that she, after doing so much damage to it, is incredibly well positioned to take advantage of.
President Trump is, with him, weakness is a provocation and capitulation is not a negotiating strategy. The great thing is right now, Canadians get it. There is this wave of patriotism in Canada, and Canadians are going to stand and fight for Canada. They need a leader who knows how to lead that fight and rally that wave of patriotism. I'm the leader who can do that.
Now, this is a joke for a bunch of different reasons, and pardon me for being so irritated at this little clip, but just for those who don't know, Chrystia Freeland, while she was Canada's Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, was involved in the decision to freeze bank accounts during the 2022 Freedom Convoy protests. So just to give you a little bit of background to that, in February 2022, the Canadian government under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, the man distinctly absent from these debates, invoked the Emergencies Act, which is the new version of the War Measures Act, to address the anti-vaccine mandate protests that were disrupting Ottawa, but also other places. But the main protest was in Ottawa. It lasted for weeks. There was hundreds of vehicles and semi-trucks parked downtown. And this was in response to vaccine mandates, first for truckers and then for other people. They were losing their jobs because they declined to get vaccinated. And they showed up in Ottawa to protest because they felt like they had no other recourse. Now, Freeland actually announced that financial institutions, and this is unprecedented, were authorized to freeze the accounts of individuals and businesses suspected of supporting or participating in these protests without requiring a court order. So this action was a broader effort to cut off funding to the protests, including targeting donations from crowdfunding platforms and cryptocurrency. By the way, my friend Andrew Lawton's book on the Freedom Convoy details the extent to which the police were actually making good progress, and they had the ability to wrap everything up peacefully, but the Trudeau government instead decided to declare the Emergency Measures Act. And Chrystia Freeland, this person who thinks she's well positioned to get out front of this wave of Canadian patriotism after squelching it the last time it erupted, confirmed on February 17, 2022, that banks had already begun freezing accounts based on intelligence they got from the RCMP, and indicated that more bank freezes would follow. The measures affected an undisclosed number of personal and corporate accounts linked to the protests, and she described the actions as necessary to defend democracy and restore peace, although this was an incredibly peaceful protest, and not the kind of peaceful protest that reporters talk about while Walmarts are burning behind them. But she did, and this is really touching, express great sorrow for needing to impose them. We still don't know exactly how many bank accounts were frozen. I was talking to somebody on the final day of the Freedom Convoy protest in Ottawa, and he talked about actually having his bank account frozen that morning. And we don't know if it was just big donors or also small donors. None of this was detailed publicly. And this decision was not just controversial, by the way, for those who supported the Freedom Convoy protest. People who are concerned about Canadian liberties and freedoms should be concerned about this decision, regardless of whether or not you agreed with the individuals who participated in the Freedom Convoy or the protest movement more generally. And in January 2024, a Canadian court, and Canadian courts, as we've discussed on the briefing before, are notoriously progressive, ruled that the use of the Emergencies Act was unreasonable and infringed on charter rights. And Chrystia Freeland and Justin Trudeau announced that they disagreed with this court ruling. Now, when conservatives disagree with court rulings, this is considered an attack on fundamental norms. It's considered a fundamental attack on Canadian institutions. But when the Prime Minister and his Finance Minister declare the equivalent of the War Measures Act and freeze people's bank accounts without a court order, and then get told by those courts that they have violated the fundamental rights of Canadians, they're fine to just dismiss that completely. And so this is a moment that should live in infamy and shame, that enormously decreased the trust Canadians have in institutions. And yet Chrystia Freeland thinks that she can get out front of this flag-waving parade, even if it includes some of the very same people whose bank accounts she froze. So it's truly ridiculous. And the only way you can believe anything she's saying is first by suspending disbelief, and second by forgetting everything she's done over the last 10 years. Let me give you another clip from Freeland here, because she was really on fire last night.
I just want to say really quickly that we need to be really careful not to repeat conservative talking points. Canada most definitely is not broken. We are a strong, resilient country. Canadians live 4 years longer than Americans, and median wealth in Canada is higher than in the US. Trump is giving us an opportunity to make a strong economy even stronger and more resilient. And I think as Liberals, we have to remember the great legacy of Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin. We are the party that believes in social policy and economic policy. We know how to deliver jobs and growth, and we know how to support people. We believe in—
So a couple things there. I know Canadians are resilient because they just survived 10 years of mismanagement under people like Freeland herself. Then why is nobody bringing up the fact that when she says Trump has given us a great opportunity to really focus on building our economy? What has she been doing for the last 10 years as finance minister and deputy prime minister? Why did Donald Trump have to give her the opportunity to start making lives better for Canadians? It's actually unbelievable that nobody has picked apart her statements and noticed that she apparently needed Trump to give her a little push in the right direction. And again, you'll notice there, she did not talk about the Trudeau legacy, her legacy. She jumped all the way back to the pre-Harper years to talk about the last Liberal government that actually cared about balancing the budget to begin with. And then you'll notice she did a little trick here. Didn't really specify. Liberals are great on not specifying. She said, well, we care about both fiscal policy and we care about social policy, which, by the way, translated means that they care both about massive carbon taxes and increasing the financial burden on everyday Canadians, but they also want to make sure that you can trans the kids. And they also want to make sure that they're defunding crisis pregnancy centers. And they also want to make sure that abortion is as widely available as they can possibly make it, assuming, of course, that there's only such a thing as an unwanted pregnancy and no such thing as an unwanted abortion. So that's the kind of person Chrystia Freeland is. I don't even think that a more eloquent speaker would be able to sell that record. She very obviously was not able to. I'll play one last clip just to give you an idea of what kind of negotiator this person is. Now, Donald Trump said that he really didn't like her as a negotiator. I'm pretty neutral on that. Obviously, Trump isn't going to like somebody who's attempting to get something different at the table than he is. But consider the fact that she's hoping to be prime minister next month. She wants to be prime minister next month. Her entire campaign, allegedly, is based on a 4-year-old girl in Saskatoon who wants to prevent Trump from invading. I don't know how good you guys feel about Chrystia Freeland standing between an invasion from Donald Trump's America and us, but I don't feel great. And this is the kind of thing she's saying publicly. And ask yourself when you watch this clip, if this puts Canada in a better or worse negotiating position with the Trump administration, which, by the way, has just gotten started. There's going to be 4 years more of this Trump administration.
We need to be ready for a world where the U.S. is not the leader of the free world anymore, Canada can be and must be a leader in building this new order. Our allies are looking to us. And if we do this, we'll make ourselves safer as well.
So a couple of things there. Our allies are not actually looking to us. One of the things that Liberals are really good at is undermining Canada's security, forcing woke policies on the military, undermining pride in our national heritage, and then simultaneously claiming that we're really, really important as a country. Canada was a middle power after World War II. We have not been a middle power for decades. The years between the two Trudeaus have been entirely devastating, and now the very people who assisted in Canada's decline in every measurable way are asking you to give the country back to them for 4 more years. And so that brings me to Mark Carney. I'm not going to show as many clips of Mark Carney because he is an unbelievably boring speaker. I'm not sure if that's by design, because he may in fact be doing this quite intentionally. He might be trying to show himself to be the adult in the room, somebody who's really calm and really measured. And while Canadians are kind of panicking about the Trump tariffs and their lizard brain is saying threat, 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 he might want to project this really competent air that makes people feel comfortable with his managerial skills. Stephen Harper very famously deliberately avoided really pump up lines in his speeches, and also delivered his speeches in a pretty sort of calm, effective managerial way. So this isn't necessarily a lack of speaking skills, except for the fact that, again, Mark Carney kept checking his notes during, like in the middle of lines that you would think he would know. Where you should show passion is if you actually believe that Donald Trump is planning to annex the country, I'd like you to appear mildly upset about that. Carney didn't appear upset about that at all, which means he's either not passionate about it or he just doesn't actually believe it. Now, his resume is what he's basically running on. He's the former governor of the Bank of Canada from 2008 to 2013, and the Bank of England from 2013 to 2020. And then he was also Trudeau's UN Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance. He's a big fan of carbon taxes. And again, if you like the Trudeau economy, you're going to love the Carney economy, because Mark Carney has been Trudeau's main advisor for years, particularly on 2 main files, which is the economy and climate change. And Trudeau has spent years trying to bring Carney explicitly into the Liberal fold. And Liberal sources last year were already referring to Carney as the prime minister in waiting, and he certainly thinks so. And Trudeau wanted to replace Chrystia Freeland with Mark Carney. You might remember that Chrystia Freeland and Justin Trudeau last fall took a brief break from wrecking Canada to try and wreck each other's careers. She resigned. A bunch of other resignations followed. Justin Trudeau replaced Chrystia Freeland in the finance portfolio with his former babysitter. That's not a joke. That's actually who he replaced Chrystia Freeland with, and asked Carney to take her place. Carney refused because he was obviously planning to do this. And so Carney's trying to present himself as sort of the competent, quiet guy in the room. He's really avoided talking about nearly all of the major social issues. So this right here, I just pulled one clip out of this 2-hour debate that encapsulates what he's running on in terms of attacking the federal Conservatives.
We will never, ever be part of the United States in any way, shape, or form. We have to recognize that the Donald Trump of today is different than the Donald Trump of several years ago. Then his objective was to take more of our market. Now he wants to take our country. Let me finish by pointing out one other thing. Who's the worst person to stand up to Donald Trump? It's Pierre Poilievre. He worships the man. He uses his language. He's not the right person for our country at this crucial time.
So that's basically what they're going to do. And they've been doing this for 4 years. This is really lazy stuff. One of the things that contributed to the toxic relationship between Trump and Trudeau is this is Trudeau's campaign strategy. For 4 years, Trudeau has basically been labeling Pierre Poilievre Trump. He's been labeling the Conservatives the MAGA Conservatives, and he's hoping that by tying Pierre to Trump, that he's going to be able to run against Trump. And Mark Carney has basically just lifted Trudeau's campaign strategy out of the Trudeau campaign, which is now dead, and plopped it into his. And now that's why he's using lines like Pierre Poilievre worships Trump, which is obviously not true. I don't think any Canadian worships Trump. And those who do are probably getting a rude wake-up call right now, realizing that this sort of inconsistent tariff war means that Trump can do a lot of damage to the Canadian economy for no conceivable reason. In fact, Ben Shapiro, the conservative commentator, said earlier this week, I get why we're tariffing Mexico. I get why we're tariffing in China, but I don't get the Canadian tariffs at all. I don't get the strategy behind them. I don't understand what he's doing here. What exactly is it that we want? And the reality is Trump hates Trudeau and he just wants tariffs. He's just throwing his weight around because that's what he wants to do in this moment. And Ben Shapiro was like the Trump explainer, where he takes a lot of the chaos going around and tries to carefully explain what the strategy behind the madness is. But even Ben Shapiro, who is somebody who voted for Trump, donated to him, gave speeches for him, doesn't have any idea what Trump's doing with Canada here. But we do know what the Liberals are going to do. They're going to use Trump to try hang on to power. And it actually has the potential of working. It's why Carney is trying to portray Pierre Poilievre as Trump Jr. And he's trying to portray himself as sort of a bland, business-like revolutionary. But it's important to remember that Mark Carney, although he is purportedly a Catholic, if that is in fact true, he's a Trudeau Catholic, that he is just as radical on social issues as Justin Trudeau is. And one of the reasons I think this is important to remember is because Canada has changed a lot socially over the last 10 years. We're the only country that is not having a robust debate on gender ideology, although that's finally started amongst the first ministers in places like Saskatchewan and Alberta. But what you see is Mark Carney trying to present himself as sort of a very calm, level-headed person, whereas Trudeau, of course, had a penchant for costumes. Who can forget his infamous India trip? He had a penchant for using really woke language like people kind. He would get really passionate, worked up when he was talking about things like abortion, things like the LGBT issue. He would get quite foam-flecked in the House of Commons when he was defending his pet social issues. Mark Carney doesn't do that kind of stuff, but he feels the same way. He has never contradicted Justin Trudeau on a single one of the radical policies that he's pushed through over the last decade. And just to give you an idea where he stands on abortion, this is very interesting coming from an alleged Catholic. In a statement posted to X on June 24, 2022, which is the day Roe v. Wade was overturned in the United States, he wrote, I'm proud to live in a country where a woman's right to choose is so strongly supported. Canada is the only democracy where there are no restrictions on abortion, and you can have an abortion right up until the 9th month, even though 80% of Canadians, according to the National Post, don't know that. He made that comment in the context of kind of contrasting Canada's stance with the U.S. Supreme Court decision. And he called the U.S. decision devastating and emphasized that progress should never be taken for granted, and underscored his undying commitment to protecting these fundamental rights. So Mark Carney, the guy in the suit who might come off as pretty reasonable, maybe a bit dorky and too reliant on his notes, but just a really competent guy who's at a lot of prestigious economic positions, he's just as radical and revolutionary as Trudeau is. He believes in abortion all the way up until 9 months, and favorably contrasted Canada's abortion regime with that in the United States. Now, for the listeners, maybe even some of you are pro-choice, but I suspect that the vast majority of you don't think that it would be okay to abort a baby at 38 weeks in the womb, which happens in Canada. And if you can't find a doctor to do it in Canada, the Canadian government takes your tax dollars and pays to fly that person into the United States to find a late-term abortionist there to do the job. And so again, I've said, I know Canada still is a majority pro-choice country, but there are far more Canadians who are close to my position on this issue than they are to Justin Trudeau's, to Chrystia Freeland's, or to Mark Carney's position. I'm going to bet that most of you who would say, I'm probably supportive of abortion in some circumstances, would not be okay with an abortion several weeks prior to birth, which, by the way, is absolutely permitted and facilitated in Canada. It is. And so that's the two main frontrunners for the Liberal leadership race. I watched it. I watched the debate so that you didn't have to, and still kind of resent the amount of time that I had to spend. But unfortunately, it's important to know what these people are saying, because one of them is going to be our next prime minister. We're going to have Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland with a mandate from a 4-year-old in Saskatoon to stop the Trump invasion of Canada, or we're going to have Justin Trudeau's climate envoy to the United Nations running the show. And so if that sounds good to you, then you might want to go check out those debates, because you're in for a really enjoyable experience. For the rest of you who buy groceries and pay taxes, I suggest that you recognize that these people are inextricably intertwined with Trudeau. And the fact that even they are running from the Trudeau legacy, the fact that nobody will use his name, is a really good indication of just how awful the last 10 years have been. Thank you all for listening to this week's episode of the Bridgehead Briefing. If you enjoyed this, please do subscribe to the podcast. If you found the content helpful, share it around. If you've got more ideas or feedback, drop that in the comment section. Thanks so much.